Welcome to the studio. I'm Keme Nzerem, and our panel with esteemed guests is State of the Nation, Cybersecurity in UK Business Today. I want to start with John Maynard from Adarma for, I guess, the helicopter view, because you have to give this advice day in, day out to clients all over the place. Where are we? UK business risks, cybersecurity. What's the big picture?
Big picture is we have a highly motivated, sophisticated adversary, which ranges from nation state through to script kiddie in the bedroom. You know, financial motivated, politically motivated, but you have a very sophisticated, mature ecosystem of an adversary. And I call it an ecosystem because effectively you've got specialists in certain parts of how to attack organizations. That situation is not getting any better. It's perhaps getting worse or changing, you know, with political and warfare, etc. But effectively then you've got an organization and a corporate structure where security has typically been an afterthought, it's been fragmented, it's been technology-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. And so we're in a state of catching up, maturing our cyber defenses, and it's always a cat and mouse sort of game about how you get that one step ahead of the adversary to make sure you innovate one step ahead. And so we're going to talk a little bit, I suspect, about cyber threats. We're going to talk about defenses and the role of a CISO and how we as individuals protect organizations, you know, but with everything that's going on, the threat landscape is as bad as it's ever been, and we suspect will get worse, but our role is to defend and continue to defend the organizations that we stand for.
And is there a typical threat? And I kind of ask this question as a curious journalist who has stood outside St. Bart's, wondering what on earth is going on with the computers, who's been called into the NCA to get a briefing on the Genesis marketplace. And you may well have listened recently to the Lazarus heist, this extraordinary story that I'm sure you're all familiar with of North Korean state hackers, which they deny. Is there a typical threat, or is it literally as varied as that?
So I think it's very context specific, you know, so your type of organization, what your organization stands for, the supply chain that your organization stands within, for example. It's not just about you as an organization, it's the context in which your business or your organization is operating within. And that means the threats that you face as an organization or as an individual, frankly, change depending on the context that you're operating in. So media-wise, you know, headlines are made with state-sponsored espionage, through politically motivated attacks, through coordinated, financially motivated attacks. You know, think about way back the Bangladeshi bank sort of attack, or the attack on SWIFT, those types of things, or national infrastructure type attacks. That's not necessarily what the everyday CISO, CIO is protecting against. You've got to protect against that, but also you've got to protect about what sounds like mundane type of things. You know, so insider threat through misconfigurations or poor hygiene in the environment, where all it takes is one little weakness in your armory, and they're in. And that can be a state-sponsored actor, it can be someone who's just got a grudge against the company, it could be an insider actor, it could be someone that's financially motivated, it could be a group, it could be a criminal gang. So it's very wide-ranging, it's very specific to the context you face within both an organization, but also the industry and the ecosystem that you operate in today.
Mm-hmm. Elaine Bucknor, recently of Sky, there is a clear value, I guess, to a hacker for going after, say, financial services. But for something that is equally totemic, broadcasting, you get to perhaps get your message out or interfere with a very public organization. How did the threat show up for you when you were at Sky?
I was just sort of, as I was listening to sort of the nature of the kind of threats that we were just sort of talking about, you know, those things are often just incredibly sort of targeted. But actually, I think for most organizations, whatever industry you're in, so much of the threat comes from the unintended consequences of somebody doing something silly, sort of opening up a kind of rogue email or something and sort of introducing the kind of threat that way. So much of how an organization thinks about defending itself against cybersecurity has to include also the volume game, which is you happen to make a small mistake, and then thinking about some of those big sort of more targeted kind of events. And certainly for organizations like Sky, any of the sort of media organizations, it used to be that you'd just drive along with a big truck and get a satellite blocker, and you'd be able to sort of disrupt the kind of services just by that sort of almost physical kind of intervention. But now, as everything's become incredibly so much more kind of connected, it's moved away from traditional satellite distribution into much more kind of broadband sort of led distribution, IP distribution. Everything's so much more kind of connected. There are a lot more sort of electronic connected parts. And so you've got to think about risk and how you manage that risk in a very, very different way. But as I say, for most organizations, it is really about the volume kind of game. One that we've seen the barrier of entry kind of slowly but surely kind of coming down. And so actually that's common across every single kind of organization.
Brian, I mean, a lot of what Elaine said there resonates with me whenever I'm working as a journalist for Channel 4 News. There are a seemingly endless kind of series of courses and awareness and don't do this. And for Channel 4, who obviously has to manage a lot of independent suppliers who then by virtue might have some kind of information or tech relationship with Channel 4, how are you managing this? It must be pretty complex.
It is complicated. I think what Elaine was saying was absolutely spot on. And it used to be the case that the hackers needed the broadcasters because they needed their audience to explain why they were doing what they were doing. And then, as you said, the technology changed and it's now more IP led, and they've realised that they can just take the audience. And so that's the risk. If they can get hold of a channel, as happened a few years ago in France and also in Australia and other places, if they can grab the channel, they can deliver the message themselves unedited, and that's the risk. And that can come from low-hanging fruit, and that's kind of the situation that we're in. So we've got over 7,000 suppliers to Channel 4. We don't make our own content. We work with production companies to produce that content. And some of those companies can be two guys in a shed that are using free email and free business systems that don't necessarily have an understanding of IT security, and they don't have that skill set. And I see them normally in two camps. One that absolutely love the advice, will go, thank you very much, and they will eat it up. And you can work with them to strengthen their security. And we're being a little bit selfish. The reason why we're doing it is because we want to improve our security, and they are a potential loophole. And then there are other companies that don't really want to take the advice. And sometimes you've just got to change the approach slightly. You've got to make them realise that what you're doing is to try and help the overall industry. And so we work quite closely with the other broadcasters, with Sky, ITV, BBC, and some of the publishers as well, to try and improve the landscape and that level of security across all of our suppliers, which will make the industry better.
And of course, there was a fairly high-profile attack of the BBC earlier this year.
Yeah, absolutely. But then at the same time, there are attacks outside of the BBC that could have an impact, and not just the BBC, Channel 4, ITV as well. It's whether or not you join the dots. But we have so many similar suppliers that it's quite a concern.
Chris, similar picture in retail?
Yeah, look, constant threats. I think, we're all dealing with the new reality of things like software as a service. So again, we can kind of build a big wall around our perimeter, but of course now, whether it be pure software providers or, kind of third-party providers to retail in terms of running supply chains, distribution, etc., it's now through a combination of stick and carrot, I think, making sure that your total ecosystem is as secure as it can be. You try and embed that in commercial relationships, but really it needs to be a partnership where people understand that you're helping or trying to help them to be as good as they can be, and by definition, therefore, helping your organisation become more secure by proxy. But it's a more complex environment that we're now managing risk around.
And it's not just a relationship with suppliers and supply chain, it's an internal relationship. And you, with your previous hat as CEO, you must have been in many, many meetings with your information, your tech teams, and perhaps, I mean, obviously one is aligned in terms of the business outcomes, but the conversation might not be that straightforward.
No, and I think, we've changed in terms of the board perception of risk now. I think a few years ago, we were trying to get boards to understand the seriousness of the risk around cyber. I think we've almost gone 180 degrees now, in as much that I think most businesses have cyber as a top 3, top 5 corporate risk. So actually boards and audit committees specifically are now paranoid about cyber security and want to talk about almost nothing else, which has obviously, there's pros and cons. In terms of pros, in terms of support, in terms of investment, prioritization, etc., but also being very needy in terms of a very clear definition of risk, a clear definition of remediation, a reassurance that everything that can be done is being done, etc. So, yeah, lots of pressure.
So, John, how do you equip them with the language and the knowledge to be able to influence effectively?
It's around that language and that communication. As a CISO or a CIO, how do you communicate to the board in a language that resonates with the C-suite or the board? It's in terms of return on investment. It's away from the technical jargon that the industry, frankly, has grown up on, right? We love an acronym. We love a 0 day. We love a threat vector. It's about return on investment. It's about risk to the business. It's about risk mitigation, and it's about lost opportunity, and it's about really communicating the steps that the organization is taking to defend, and then communicating the risk of doing or not doing a certain thing, putting in a certain control, taking a certain action. It's that language and communication to get the board comfortable with what is a complex topic, to the point raised previously. Simplify in a return on investment type language and communicate risk.
Elaine, does that resonate with you? Because I guess the other challenge is in that CISO role, you don't want to permanently be the doomsayer. You need to be offering innovation and creativity. And again, the tonality of that discussion in the C-suite. How do you balance that and move forward and keep the organisation safe?
I mean, it's really interesting just listening to that sort of board conversation. I sat with many boards, and also I sit on a couple of boards, so it's also very interesting being on the other side. I think back to where conversations sort of started. I think every sort of CISO was going in the room and talking about patching. How many systems are up to date? How many have you patched? And the truth is, not one single person around the table knew what that meant. And actually, it lacked a whole load of kind of context, because, just by saying you were 90% patched did not mean that was a good thing if all of your critical systems, platforms, and services were not in the most secure state. So we're having these conversations that were partly delivered on the basis of fear. You're going to get a thumping great big fine, or the world is coming to an end. We're all doomed unless you create and give us that sort of investment. But I think what's happened now, especially as each industry has experienced some sort of big event, they've sort of flip the conversation into talking more about what does that mean for our business or our organization. So the word is context, absolute context. So I think what CISOs are doing now is they're understanding where the business is at. They're understanding if they're about to launch a new product, a new service. They're understanding whether or not they're going to create some new messages, some new marketing for their industry. And within that, you can then start to explain risk. When we're doing this, these could be the consequences if we don't get this kind of stuff right. So it's finding a different way of explaining ostensibly the same thing, but really sort of demonstrating that you really, as a CISO, understand what that organization is trying to achieve, where it's at in its corporate agenda, and then kind of creating a narrative that sort of resonates a lot sort of more so. I also think probably the second thing I mentioned is I also think that the language of cyber, there's a degree of fatigue around, oh my gosh, it's cybersecurity all over again, and back to we're all doomed and we're all about to be fined. But there is a degree of fatigue, and I think that people are trying to move the conversation on a little bit more and trying to put cyber in the context of broader resilience. You need to continue to deliver the services that you have provided, or you provide to customers or internally, and therefore, in order to do that, what does that mean? And cyber is a part of it, but not the beginning and the end of it.
Chris, you're
Yeah, I think that's in terms of communication and language, it's interesting that those standard frameworks, ISO 2001 and NIST and COBIT and all those things, are I think the first generation has enabled us to have a kind of standard assessment, which is quite reassuring to audit committees. So, they like that, seeing that we're a 2 here and a 4 there. On average, we're a 2.7 and we should be a 4.1. And that's kind of reassuring because it's very quantitative.
All green on the rag.
But actually, it kind of doesn't, the language becomes if you're not careful, it becomes a tick box exercise. And that doesn't really describe the risk. The risk is, phishing, malware. So it's great to know that this technical control is green, and this technical control is amber, and we need to do a bit of work on it. But actually, are we protected against a phishing attack and subsequent, malware in our network? So I think it's an and. I think it's the frameworks have got to have a place in terms of reassuring and giving a level of independence to that assessment. But I think the language then becomes, if we're not careful, it becomes a language of tick boxes, which doesn't really describe risk in any organisation.
So in that context, Brian, how do you prioritise?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, at the moment, with the financial situation as it is, it's about making the most of what you've got and securing your assets. And your biggest asset is going to be your staff. So for me, it's training and awareness. As many tools as I've got, whether or not I've got NIST, whether I've got ISO 27001, whether I'm green, and all those boxes are ticked and all my technical controls are there, if I haven't explained to people not to click that email or click that link,
and are people still clicking the link?
Do you know how sophisticated those emails are getting now? I struggle sometimes to work out if they're real or not. And of course, you've got the dreaded AI now, which is being used as a tool for good, but also for bad, that's generating those. So I'm afraid I don't blame anybody if they click on the link, particularly when they're under pressure. And obviously there is a lot of pressure in the workplace at the moment to be able to deliver. You can't blame them if you click on them, but you've got to try and educate them, as well as putting the tools in place to try and stop it. You've got to assume that one might get through and what you're going to do. And as you said, it's about that resilience, how you're going to react. All of these things have been around for years. It's just we put terms on them. When we were calling it cloud, we were all worried because, oh my God, there's no security. But now we call it software as a service, and we start to feel a little bit better about it, and those have evolved as well. We talk about resilience now. Well, we were always saying it's not if, it's when, and then we were worried. But now we talk about resilience instead of continuity, and suddenly we feel as though there's a plan coming together. And there is, because we've had the time to think about it. AI, we haven't had time to think about. When drones were released to the general public, we didn't have time to think about those. When the internet was released, we didn't have time to think about that. Where's the governance? Where's the plan? How are we going to cope? And slowly we get to catch up. But as we know, we're playing catch up, and that's always the worry.
Mm-hmm. Well, AI, now is the time to think about it. And white paper, unclear governance, lack of alignment between the UK and Europe. How do you think AI is going to change, or is it changing the game in terms of cyber risk, Brian?
It's going to raise the game. Absolutely. And it's unfortunate that we're in this situation, that we haven't learned our lessons as a community from the past with other things. There's this race among the big tech giants to release it and to improve it and to get it out there without thinking about any of the consequences or the controls that need to be in place. It will do an awful lot of good. Every single company is looking at it straight away, thinking, how can we leverage this? How can we improve the way in which we're selling our products, improving our products so that we can use it to our advantage? The bad is going, how is this going to make our lives easier? I mean, don't forget, cybercrime is the third biggest economy in the world after, I think it's the US and China. Yeah, and yet how much budget does each company give towards their cybersecurity? How can they expect us to compete against that kind of stuff, particularly when the baddies have got things like AI and cloud and and all that, everything under their control, and they don't have any laws to have to follow. Whereas when we respond, we have to follow in the eye of the law.
Well, I think the comment there was spot on, right? Every time we use a tool on the defensive side. These tools are used for adversarial purposes on the attacker side, right? We've seen that with NSA tool leakages in attacks. You see that with tools that incident responders and red teamers use to conduct their activities. You see on the attacker side as well. So this race between the defenders and the adversary is absolutely what we will see with a new technology, generative AI. And there are benefits on the defense side around efficiency, around, security is typically a big data problem, and it's only becoming more and more data oriented with the attack surface that was mentioned by both my colleagues here around, IP connectivity and cloud and everything like that. So more and more data we've got to look at, we've got to really understand what's happening.
Yeah.
AI can help that and help threat detection and help automate response, help give you more intelligence with, to Elaine's point, the context of your business. That's really, really important. But equally, it's going to make the adversary side easier, quicker, speed it up. It's probably not innovating in terms of what they're actually doing, but it will speed up and make it easier. The entry point is going to be a lot easier to come in.
The wisdom on the street is that this is a huge juncture in the kind of grand history of human development. Yet at the same time, people were terrified when the printing press came along. So in your view, is in terms of the risk to cyber security, is this an incremental change, or is it a fundamental branch?
I think it depends how you look at it over the next 6 to 12 months. So if we, again, get to know the technology, understand how it can be used, you can see vendors and tools using that as part of their own tooling, so whether that's the Microsoft tooling, whether Google, for example, you can see it on the adversarial side around automated attacks, around playbook design and what we're doing here. So I think it's making sure that we understand how these technologies can be used in both contexts and making sure that we don't over-govern what we're doing and over-regulate what we're doing, but that we have a clear idea of how these tools can be used.
Elaine, you were nodding there. Was that in response to we shouldn't over-govern, or was that something else? Because it's a big issue, the governance piece,
Governance
isn't it?
is a big issue,
Yeah, with any kind of any new tech regulation will at some point in time kind of follow, and there will be. I think it will be accelerated this time round simply because the sort of the human impact, the ethics kind of it all. But there are some tools that we've been using in the cyber industry for a long time, which are still sort of allegedly sort of all about kind of AI and machine learning. Sort of it's that data generation and kind of processing power, which I think is the thing that drives the sort of biggest kind of change. But I think one of the qualities or attributes of CISOs is this kind of almost relentless kind of curiosity. And I think with that, it drives you to look for the upside and for the downside of any of those kind of emerging techs. We're just going to have to get quicker and slightly sort of smarter about it. But I think one of the things it will do is it will drive industry to work, again, much more collaboratively. I think cyber is one of those very unique parts of tech where everybody really needs to kind of pull together and share learning and knowledge as to how you solve for what can be these sort of devastating kind of cyber events. So yes, completely agree with what my fellow panelists have said.
We've had it in the back office for some time. I think machine learning algorithms have been there in our security operations centers, in our chatbot design, in our forecasting engines that we use in retail. That's, I'm going to say it's old technology, but we've had it for quite some years now. But it's now in the front office. It's accessible to all, and it's making us think. The bit that I think makes me think, the first thing I think about is kind of the data leakage aspect of it.
Yeah.
I heard an anecdote the other day, I don't actually know where it came from, but a kind of finance analyst preparing for annual results day used an AI website and put in all of the company's financial information yet to be released in order to come up with a great presentation. and they were doing, they did a great job, and they thought they were doing the right thing for the company.
Where did
but they
that
actually
data end up
inputted the financial runs of the organisation into some AI software. That's the kind of bit that starts to the first step of what I'm worried about. But I think that's the kind of thing we probably have most of the tools we need to prevent most of that happening now. We just need to adapt our thinking and adapt some of the tooling that we already have to make sure that we kind of close that door.
And to Elaine's point that actually this requires cross-industry, cooperation and collaboration at a pre-competitive level, because it's in nobody's interests for this to run out of hand.
I think we rely sometimes
exactly.
on service, service providers and partners to provide those common controls that we can benefit from other organisations and other sectors that are maybe ahead of.
And I think this is going to, it's such a common geographical global challenge that as an industry, whether it's the security industry, collaborating, which it does very well in situations such as this, comes together. But technology, really coming together from a geographical, from a regulation, from a governance perspective, from a technology leadership perspective, to understand the pros and the cons of this type of technology, that's desperately needed.
And just to kind of loop back, because you mentioned the global nature of the threat, yet there are clearly geographical or regional differences. What in your view, John, are the specific threats that distinguish the UK business environment?
Yeah, well, so we've just released our UK cyber threats report, which analyses the sort of top cyber threats that are impacting UK business at the moment. So top of the list for us is identity access brokers, and that's fueled the growth and expansion of crimeware as a service or ransomware as a service. Basically, it's that specialized, sophisticated part of the adversarial network that effectively specializes in getting that first access into a network. So specialized in that, really know how to do that, and effectively you can buy initial access packages for $5, something like that. Not a lot of money on the internet, and that fuels effectively an expansion in crimeware as a service or ransomware as a service. That's readily available. So that's what we've seen is actually advertising for identity brokerage services has increased by 122% year over year. So absolutely is something that is a specialized skill that is being monetized and is relatively cheap to buy. That's fueling the ransomware as a service that we've seen over the past few years. The other one would be, I think it was mentioned around the low-hanging fruit, right? The humans, the manual error, business email compromise. Still, email phishing is very difficult to detect some of these sophisticated email phishing attacks, especially when it goes after VIP accounts or C-suite, or if it's a product launch, the product manager, product leader, very context specific. So that business email compromise is really, really critical at the moment. And then the other one would be around cyber extortion and how we have seen in the past ransomware attacks as an example, not only looking at data exfiltration, but extortion at the same time. We've seen a decrease in what's called double extortion, where it's exfiltrated and also ransomed at the same time. But effectively, that commonality of multiple strands happening at the same time. You might have a ransomware attack, then you might have a DDoS attack at the same time. Those types of things where it's multiple threaded, we're seeing quite a bit of increase in that.
And ransomware as a service, where it may once have been largely dark web, what I saw with Genesis was that it was, there's a lot of this stuff, it's just on the web for anyone.
Right, unfortunately,
anyone can see it.
You've just got to look for it.
I want to wrap us up by kind of considering a slightly wider viewpoint, and that is the CISO or the CIO as a leader. And hopefully most organizations are seeing an integration of that leadership and that knowledge and expertise in the C-suite. But I just wanted to get some reflections. I want to start with you, Elaine. Your learnings and your experience, perhaps with the advantage of no longer being quite so closely in it. What has changed, and what is your kind of big learning as a technology leader responsible for security in a big organization? What are the big learnings for you after a long and significant time in the industry?
Well, there's some good and bad. I mean, one of the bad is it's that there's no end to it kind of thing. It's this continuous. You can guarantee that something's going to change. I don't know. Whenever you hit a point in your career, you're always asked about hindsight, and we know that can be utterly useless in some respects because every circumstance has changed. Whether it's the people that sit around it, whether it's the business model, whether it's the sort of economic kind of environment. So I think it's back to my point about this sort of relentlessness and this relentless need for kind of knowledge and to continuously build on that sort of understanding. It's so important that you have that mindset because what it does do is it gives you context in which to make decisions and to assess risk. I think the idea of kind of collaboration, CISOs were always jarring with CTOs and other sort of technical teams. It's now got to be done sort of more in a hand-in-glove way. You've got to leverage that relationship to drive change. And I think the third thing that I would add is that it's got to be about the entire culture and community of the organization. You've got to bleed it in from the top. And it is so incredibly important to address some of the volume issues that businesses kind of experience.
Chris, I can only assume with your CEO hat that resonates.
No, I think a couple of things I think I would reflect on. I think got to try and find a way of making this everyone's problem.
Yeah, sure.
I think there is a danger in some of the organisations that I've worked in that it's because there's an IT security team and there's a CISO,
they look after
they'll sort it out.
Yeah.
And of course, to some extent, that is true. But particularly in a technology organisation, and ideally more widely with the likes of phishing going on, but specifically in technology, got to feel as though this is a priority, this is important, we're all prioritising this, we all understand the risks, and we all play a part in mitigating those risks. Now, that's a bit of a challenge because how much do you share? If there's a gaping hole over there and a flashing red, do you really want to tell a few hundred people that there's a flashing red over there, or we all need to take responsibility for fixing it? So there's a little bit of a balance and nervousness there, but I think that's one of the challenges. And then I think the other one that's kind of looking down into the organisation. In terms of looking up, I've already said, I think most corporates now have cyber up there in terms of on their corporate risk register. I think the good news is that gives, whether it be CTOs or CISOs or CIOs, permission and really a responsibility to get in front of the board, to develop a relationship with non-executive directors and start to hopefully educate them, but open up to them and gain their support for the prioritization, the funding, whatever it might be that you need in order to get the job done. And you've never really, so that's an advantage of how you're dealing with all of these risks. It gives you kind of permission to knock on doors and start to develop those relationships and build that level of support for your agenda. And I think, we need to do more of that as kind of technology leadership, where typically maybe we've been a bit more, we haven't been on as much on that corporate agenda.
Support and empowerment, Brian.
Sounds lovely. Like some of that. I can't fault those points. The one thing that I would probably add to it is about foot soldiers. So whilst you're talking about leadership, you're talking about trying to get the buy-in from the top down. Don't underestimate the rest of the staff that you have. And with the fact that cyber has become more prevalent, more common in the press more, it means that there is more interest from your own staff. And if you can get them on board, then they are going to be your best tool to protect the company.
A message you presumably repeat time and time again, John.
Yeah, I'd second all those comments, right? I mean, it happens to be Mental Awareness Week this week. Security has a real problem in this area. It's a combination of remote working, the stress that Elaine was talking about on the security team from CISO all the way down. There's the CISO tenure is relatively short, traditionally. Mainly pressure, mainly isolation of the role. There's some reports out there around 80%, I think it is, of CISOs rate their stress levels as moderately to tremendously high. I mean,
Because the role is all about risk.
This is what the teams are, and it's not just the CISO. That impacts obviously the whole team. It impacts the function as a whole. So, we just got out of a very substantial incident response from a large FTSE 100 organisation. And to your point, the foot soldiers, the team on the ground, were operating without sleep, 24 hours, weeks at a time. No people to rotate, no people to roll out, single-threaded skills. So actually, I'm the only person that knows how to do this, so therefore I can't sleep. Almost, come out of that with sort of PTSD type symptoms. Like, they really care about what they're doing. And I think the passion from a security perspective, whether it's leader or the teams, to protect their organization, I think is now being acknowledged slightly more than it was in the past. I think to your point, there needs to be more awareness of this security team is not just there alone protecting the organization. It needs to be embedded in the business. It's an organizational challenge. We are seeing some of our, our customer base, some of our CISOs move into CIO roles, into CTO roles. So I think that's really, really good, because that sort of shows security is important, security is embedded in technology, digital transformation, understanding of how and the context of where the business is going. So I see that as a positive step, but it still can be quite a stressful, isolated role.
John, thank you for that. Food for thought for colleagues watching, for everyone watching live, and for anyone interested in the topic. You have been watching a brilliant panel here on cyber security threats to the UK business community right now. This is The Studio. Thanks for watching.